members. Good evening all. I welcome all our KP members for today's clinical meet. I welcome Dr. Rahul Patil sir, who will be presenting case scenarios regarding epilepsy in children. I welcome Dr. Nanivdekar sir, who will be presenting few interesting pediatric cases. So, Dr. Rahul Patil sir has done DNB Pediatrics at University College of Medical Sciences and GTBH Delhi Government Medical College. He has done British Pediatric Neurology Association certified course in pediatric neurology. He has done his pediatric neurology training at Bharti Hospital, Pune. He has done a poster presentation at National Childhood Disability Conference, Delhi. And he has done one paper presentation at National Neuropedicon, Thrissur, Kerala. He has 9 publications in national and international journals. So I request Dr. Rahul sir to continue with our first session. Rahul sir, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, madam, for your kind introduction. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So, good evening, everyone. I will share my screen. Is it visible?
No, you are continue, Rahul.
Yes. Okay. So, good evening, everyone. Today, I am presenting the topic.
Sir, do the slideshow, please. Sorry, sir.
Okay. So today I am presenting the topic epilepsy in children with case scenarios. So in this topic, I will cover definition of epilepsy by International League Against Epilepsy 2017, then new classification of epilepsy by ILE with case scenarios, and also discuss etiologies of epilepsy and epilepsy syndrome with case scenarios. And at last, we'll discuss indications of EEG and neuroimaging in epilepsy. So first, what is epileptic seizure? So epileptic seizure is a transient occurrence of signs and symptoms due to abnormal, excessive or synchronous neuronal activity in the brain. And an epileptic seizure occurs due to disruption of the electrical activity of the brain. So there is any disturbance or any disruption of the electrical activity of the brain that causes epileptic seizure. So in 2014, the ILE suggested the following practical definition of epilepsy. And in 2017, it has been accepted. So at least 2 unprovoked seizures occurring more than 24 hours apart, or 1 unprovoked seizure, and there is probability of further seizures similar to the general recurrence risk after 2 unprovoked seizures. Suppose there is one patient of cerebral palsy of 2 years, and he has gliosis due to hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy in neonatal period. So he came with 1 unprovoked seizure. So in that case, there is probability of further seizures similar to the general recurrence risk after 2 unprovoked seizures. So in that case also, we can call epilepsy after 1 unprovoked seizure. Then comes diagnosis of an epilepsy syndrome. If we are diagnosing epilepsy syndrome on the basis of clinical features and EEG, then also it becomes epilepsy directly. So ILE suggested following classification at 3 levels. One is diagnosis of seizure type, then epilepsy type, and then epilepsy syndrome. So we'll see in the next slide. So seizure types are focal onset, generalized onset, and unknown onset. Focal onset we know, generalized onset we know. Unknown onset is the onset where onset is unwitnessed. We don't know what is the onset. Then comes etiology. These are the few etiologies: structural, genetic, infectious, metabolic, immune, and unknown. So we'll discuss in further slides about the etiology. After seizure types comes epilepsy types. So epilepsy types are 2 or more focal seizure becomes focal epilepsy, 2 or more generalized seizure, generalized epilepsy. Similarly, there may be combined generalized and focal epilepsy in some cases like Lennox-Gastaut syndrome or Dravet syndrome. Then comes unknown epilepsy. Unknown epilepsy is where we don't know what is the onset, and EEG is also normal. In that case, we also can call unknown epilepsy. Next classification comes epilepsy syndrome. On the basis of history, suppose one patient of focal epilepsy and he has seizures in the night, in the sleep, and he has EEG suggestive of centrotemporal spikes. So it becomes benign epilepsy with centrotemporal spikes, that is Rolandic epilepsy. So we can directly classify it in epilepsy syndrome. So further classification is epilepsy syndrome. Then there are comorbidities. So many epilepsies are associated with comorbidities like developmental delay, autism, ADHD, or learning disabilities. So this will be the epilepsy. How will you write final diagnosis? So I am giving one example: focal epilepsy due to some structural etiology like gliosis with comorbidities. We can write final diagnosis. In epilepsy syndrome, we can directly write the name of the epilepsy syndrome. So this is ILE classification 2017. Then generalized seizure. How generalized seizure occurs? It starts at different points in the brain, but it rapidly engage bilaterally corticothalamic circuits, and it causes generalized seizure. So it rapidly engage bilaterally distributed networks and causes generalized seizure. So this is the theoretically a generalized seizure start at different points in the network and it rapidly engage bilaterally distributed networks. Then focal seizure is localized to one area or it may spread to other side, causes focal to bilateral tonic-clonic seizure. Then ILE has further classified focal seizures into aware and impaired awareness, then motor and non-motor, and focal to bilateral tonic-clonic. And generalized onset are further classified into motor and non-motor, and generalized onset seizures are associated with impaired awareness. Similarly, unknown onset are classified. So awareness means person is aware of self and environment throughout the seizure, even if immobile. So after awareness and impaired awareness, these are the important slides, first few slides. So kindly bear me. So these are the first is the after awareness and impaired awareness. There is motor onset and non-motor onset. In motor onset, there is automatism, atonic seizure. Atonic seizure is sudden loss of muscle tone lasting for 2 to 3 seconds. Then clonic is a repetitive jerking of the muscles, we know. Then epileptic spasm is the sudden flexion or extension of proximal muscles or truncal muscles lasting for 1 to 2 seconds. Hyperkinetic is the rapid movements of upper limbs or lower limbs. Pedaling movements come under hyperkinetic. Myoclonic is sudden brief contraction of the muscles lasting less than 100 milliseconds. It is very brief. Then tonic is sustained contraction of the muscles lasting for few seconds to minutes. So we'll see few videos. This is epileptic spasm. Child has extensor epileptic spasm. Other one. So this child has epileptic spasm. It has duration of around 1 second. Then this is the focal tonic seizure. It is continuing. It is continuing to seconds to minutes. So these are the differentiating points. So epileptic spasm has duration of around 1 second. Myoclonic has duration of less than 100 milliseconds, and tonic has duration of seconds to minutes. Then comes non-motor onset. So in non-motor onset, there are autonomic. Autonomic means there are autonomic manifestations in the form of gastrointestinal, vasomotor, or pseudomotor. There may be vomiting, sweating, or tachycardia. Then behavioral arrest, there is sudden arrest of motor activity. That may be behavioral arrest. Then cognitive. In cognitive comes language, then memory, then praxis. So there may be impaired language or positive features like deja vu, that is feeling of experienced this situation previously, hallucination, perceptual distortions. Then comes emotional. So at the onset, there may be anxiety features, fear or joy. These are the non-motor onset. And the last one is sensory. In sensory, there is abnormal perception of sensations like somatosensory, abnormal perception of touch, or olfactory, abnormal perception of smell, gustatory, abnormal perception of taste. So these are the non-motor onset seizures. Then comes focal to bilateral tonic-clonic seizures. Similarly, generalized onset seizures were classified into motor and non-motor. Motor is similar to the focal onset. In non-motor, absence is the typical and atypical. Typical is the sudden onset, sudden offset of impairment of consciousness lasting for around 10 to 20 seconds. And atypical has slow onset and slow offset of impairment of consciousness with loss of tone in some cases, and it may last around 30 seconds. Absence sometimes associated with myoclonic seizures, and it may be sometimes associated with eyelid myoclonia, that is fluttering of eyelids, Jivan syndrome. So these are the classification of focal onset, generalized onset, and further are the unknown onset classification. So now we move to the case scenarios. So an 8-year-old boy with normal development woken up 3 times in the last 6 months with drooling and inability to speak. And he was aware during the episode. And he has twitching of his face and deviation of mouth to right side, and later clonic movements of right hand and leg in sleep. And these episodes last 3 minutes. So he has focal seizure, there's a twitching of his face and deviation of mouth to right side. Then he was aware, and then clonic. So the classification is focal, aware, clonic seizure. And these episodes happen in the sleep. Now these episodes, 3 episodes in the last 6 months. So it is focal epilepsy. Is it epilepsy syndrome? So we'll see in the next slide. So we have done EEG showing centrotemporal spikes. So this is benign epilepsy with centrotemporal spikes. Now the word is changed to childhood epilepsy with centrotemporal spikes. So this is Rolandic epilepsy. Etiology is unknown. Age of onset 4 to 10 years. It has focal seizures associated with drooling, dysarthria, speech arrest, tingling, and hemiclonic seizures sometimes. Sometimes focal to bilateral tonic-clonic seizures. And the frequency of seizures are typically low. In this condition, EEG shows centrotemporal spikes with dramatic activation during sleep. MRI is normal. It responds to carbamazepine, and spontaneous remission occurs usually by puberty. And many patients have normal cognition, but learning and behavioral disorders can occur in these patients. Next case is 3-year-old male patient with normal development came with history of severe vomiting with sweating, and he has deviation of eyes and head to one side. Each episode lasts for 3 to 4 minutes with impaired awareness. So here deviation of eyes and head to one side, focal, impaired awareness. Now vomiting and sweating. So it is autonomic. So focal, impaired awareness, autonomic seizure. And 3 episodes in last 3 months. So it is focal epilepsy. Now we will see, is it any epilepsy syndrome? So EEG showing bilateral occipital spikes. So this is Panaytopoulos syndrome. This is early onset occipital epilepsy. The onset is in early childhood, 1 to 14 years of age, and it has focal autonomic seizures that are often prolonged. And EEG shows high amplitude focal spikes, mostly in the occipital region. In this syndrome, seizures are very infrequent, with 25% only having single seizure and 50% having 6 seizures or less. And remission typically occurs within a few years from onset, and it responds to carbamazepine. Sometimes drug treatment also not required. So these are the terms we don't use now. So these terms no longer in use. That is, complex partial is replaced by focal impaired awareness, simple partial focal aware, partial focal, psychic is cognitive, dyscognitive is focal impaired awareness, and secondary generalized tonic-clonic seizures are focal to bilateral tonic-clonic seizures. Now we move to the etiologies of epilepsy. So First is the structural causes. There are malformation of cortical development that cause focal cortical dysplasia or lissencephaly. There may be vascular malformation, cerebral angioma, Sturge-Weber syndrome, arteriovenous malformation, hippocampal sclerosis, some acquired causes like hypoxic ischemic injury, traumatic brain injury, tumors, porencephalic cyst. These are the few structural causes of epilepsy. So we'll see one example. This patient came to me in January. He came with history of generalized seizures. This is 10 years old male child with normal birth and normal development. Came with history of generalized seizures with loss of awareness lasting for 4 to 5 minutes. And he has 2 episodes in last 3 days. So we have done EEG. EEG showing right centroparietal slowing in awake state. And in sleep, there are spikenary discharges or same region, that is right centroparietal region. So we have done MRI. MRI showing, you compare right and left side. This is left and this is right. On right side, this is sylvian fissure and this is peri-Rolandic region and this is insular cortex. So there is thickening of insular cortex and peri-Rolandic region. Similarly, we can see in this image, there is thickening of insular cortex. So in coronal section also, we can see abnormal differentiation of gray matter here at sylvian fissure. Similarly, we can see here. So this is focal cortical dysplasia. So I started on oxcarbazepine. Now up till now he is seizure free since last 6 months. So focal cortical dysplasia are localized regions of malformed cerebral cortex and they are common cause of focal seizures. The clinical presentation depends on the extent and location of the malformation. And the onset of seizures in 2/3 patients have before 5 years of age, and most patients have seizure onset by 16 years of age. And around 80% of patients become drug resistant. So if they become drug resistant, we have to see for the epilepsy surgery. Next etiology is genetic etiology. First is the chromosomal abnormalities and then gene abnormalities. So there are many causes of chromosomal abnormalities. So what are the chromosomal abnormalities can be there? One is the aneuploidy can be there, and deletions, duplications. And in gene abnormalities, there is specific genetic mutations. Suppose I am giving one example. TSC1 and TSC2 are causing tuberous sclerosis. SCN1A causing Dravet syndrome. So these are the few examples of genetic abnormalities. How we can diagnose chromosomal abnormalities? By karyotyping and chromosomal microarray. And in gene abnormalities, we can diagnose with the help of next generation sequencing, like clinical exome sequencing, whole exome sequencing, or whole genomic sequencing. Infectious cause. The commonest etiology for epilepsy is infection in our country. Infection in the CNS cause acute symptomatic seizure at the time of infection, but later on, because of the damage occurred to the brain, it causes epilepsy. So it causes post-infectious epilepsy. So we know the causes: tuberculosis, HIV, bacterial meningitis, encephalitis, neurocysticercosis. They can cause later on epilepsy. These are the metabolic causes. Biotinidase deficiency is associated with alopecia, dermatitis, and seizures in early infancy. And similarly, folinic acid responsive seizures. Glucose transporter 1 deficiency is associated with early onset abscess seizures. Pyridoxine dependent epilepsy is associated with drug resistant seizures in neonates. Then there are immune causes. There is Rasmussen syndrome and autoimmune encephalitis. So previously, Rasmussen syndrome was called Rasmussen encephalitis. Previously, thought it was infection, but now it has been proven that it is immune mediated, and it has intractable focal seizures and progressive hemiparesis in a previously normal child. And on imaging, there is progressive hemiatrophy on the side contralateral to the hemiparesis. They sometimes respond to immunotherapy and sometimes require surgical management, like hemisphere 2. So next is the autoimmune causes. This anti-NMDA receptor antibody encephalitis, then voltage-gated potassium channel antibody encephalitis, then glutamic acid decarboxylase 65 antibody encephalitis. So these are the autoimmune encephalitis. They present with psychiatric manifestation, with seizures, with ultrasensorium, sometimes with autonomic manifestation. And they also respond to immunotherapy. And there are many patients who have, we don't get cause. So there are many patients with epilepsy with unknown causes. One example is FIRS, that is febrile infection related epilepsy syndrome. So it occurs between 2 to 17 years of age. Febrile upper respiratory or GI illness precedes the onset of seizures by 1 to 14 days, and it rapidly progresses to refractory status, and it has high mortality, and in surviving patients, there may be cognitive and neurological impairment and ongoing seizures. Next topic is the epilepsy syndrome. So what is epilepsy syndrome? It is a cluster of features which has typical seizure types and typical EEG, and most of the times imaging is normal that tend to occur together. So this is about the epilepsy syndrome, and it has typical age of onset and remission, and seizure triggers like hyperventilation causes seizures in childhood absence epilepsy, diurnal variation where in childhood epilepsy with benign epilepsy with centrotemporal spikes, we get seizures in sleep, and sometimes we can predict prognosis on the basis of epilepsy syndrome. So these are the examples: benign familial neonatal epilepsy, benign non-familial neonatal seizures that are present in neonates, and early myoclonic encephalopathy, Ohara syndrome. So these two are epileptic encephalopathy. So what is epileptic encephalopathy? So epilepsy itself causes a cognitive and behavioral impairment more than expected from the underlying pathology. So it itself causes cognitive and behavioral impairment. So epilepsy syndromes in infancy, benign familial infantile epilepsy, benign myoclonic epilepsy infancy, West syndrome, Dravet syndrome, migratory focal epilepsy infancy. So we'll see one case with this epilepsy syndrome. 8 months old child came with history of perinatal asphyxia, developmental delay, and he has symmetrical flexor spasms, epileptic spasms after awakening in clusters since last 1 month. So we have done EEG showing generalized burst of spicaneous discharges followed by suppression of background around 1 second. 1 second is between these two dark lines, there is 1 second. So this is burst suppression pattern. And this modified hypsarrhythmia, this is chaotic background with high amplitude multifocal spicaneous discharges everywhere. So this is modified hypsarrhythmia. This is West syndrome. So we know about the West syndrome. So next, epilepsy syndromes in childhood. Benign epilepsy with centrotemporal spikes is the common one. Then childhood absence epilepsy. We also seen Panetobolus syndrome, febrile seizure plus genetic epilepsy with febrile seizure plus, and some epileptic encephalopathy like LGS, that is Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, Landau-Kleffner syndrome, or CSWS, that is continuous spike wave in sleep. So we'll see a few examples of these epilepsy syndromes. 6 years old boy, he came with repeated episodes of suddenly stop talking and stare blankly in the space. He doesn't respond to surrounding people. Each episode lasts about 10 to 20 seconds, and similar episode 10 to 15 times per day since last 2 months. So he has sudden onset impairment of consciousness and sudden offset lasting for 10 to 20 seconds. So it is absence seizure. So we'll see EEG. EEG showing 3 Hz spike and wave discharges. So what is 3 Hz spike and wave discharges? In this case, in between these two dark lines, there is 1 second, and we are getting 3 Hz, 1, 2, 3. 3 spike and wave discharges. So this is 3 Hz spike and wave discharges, and it happens sometimes during hyperventilation. So we are doing hyperventilation during EEG, and we are getting this picture. So this is childhood absence epilepsy. It has age of presentation in 2 to 12 years. Both sexes are equally affected. A previous history of febrile seizures may occur in 15 to 20% of cases. Other histories are normal, that is neurological examination, development, cognition are normal. Treatment is ethosuximide. Now it is available in India since last 2 to 3 years. Then we can use also sodium valproate. and it is pharmacoresponsive epilepsy. Now the ILE has changed the words for benign epilepsy also. It is self-limited or pharmacoresponsive epilepsies. Next case is 9-year-old male child with normal birth and development. He came with history of complex febrile seizures at 4 years of age. So he has proper febrile seizure at 4 years of age. Then he has febrile seizure at 6.5 years of age, above 6 years. Then he has unprovoked febrile seizures in the form of generalized tonic-clonic seizure with uprolling of eyeballs, 2 episodes in last 1 week. Father had history of febrile seizures. So what is the diagnosis? So we have done EEG showing generalized spiky nerve discharges. First, we will see what is febrile seizure plus. Then we will discuss the diagnosis. When the presence of febrile seizures above 6 years of age, then we call it febrile seizure plus. It may be associated with febrile seizures in the form of generalized seizure or focal seizures. So important point is presence of febrile seizures above 6 years of age, it is febrile seizure plus. It may be associated with unprovoked febrile seizure. So what is GEPS plus? That is genetic epilepsy with febrile seizure plus. Here family history is positive. So in the family, someone has febrile seizures. So if family history is positive, then it becomes genetic epilepsy with febrile seizure plus. So family members may have febrile seizure plus or GEPS plus, or more severe syndromes like Dravet syndrome or DUS syndrome can be present in the family. So Dravet syndrome has SCN1A mutation. At one end, it can present as Dravet syndrome. At one end, in some patients, we can get genetic epilepsy with febrile seizure plus. So one gene causing different phenotypes, that is phenotypic variability. So this epilepsy is self-limiting. It resolved by puberty. Sodium valproate is the drug of choice. Other drugs, levetiracetam, lamotrigine, ethosuximide, clomazone can be used. Then epilepsy syndromes in adolescence. There are juvenile absence, juvenile myoclonic, and epilepsy with generalized tonic-clonic seizures. These are the common ones in adolescence. So we'll see one case. 13-year-old female child came with history of sudden falls twice in last month, and also she has history of dropping of things in the morning since last 3 months. So what are the causes of sudden falls in epilepsy? There may be tonic seizure, atonic seizure, or myoclonic jerks that can cause sudden falls in epilepsy. So probably she has myoclonic seizures and 2 episodes of GTCS in last 2 months. She has normal birth and normal development. So we have done EEG. So EEG is showing generalized spike in wave discharges. So our diagnosis is juvenile myoclonic epilepsy. So she has myoclonic seizures and generalized tonic-clonic seizures. Onset is between 8 to 25 years of age. Both males and females equally affected. Birth history, development, cognition, and neurological examination will be normal. Interictal EEG may show generalized spike and wave, polyspike and wave, usually at 3.5 to 6 Hz. Sodium valproate is the drug of choice. Other drugs like lamotrigine, levetiracetam, topiramate, or clomazone can be used. Investigations. So we'll move to the investigations. First investigation is the electroencephalography, EEG. The EEG remains key to the investigation of the epilepsies, but it has to be interpreted in the context of the clinical history. EEG records the difference in electrical potential between 2 different recording locations over a period of time. First, I will discuss what are the drawbacks of EEG. Then we will discuss indications. It has lack of sensitivity. Even in patients with definite epilepsy, a single EEG is normal in 40 to 50% of cases. Then it also lack of specificity. 5 to 10% of normal children who doesn't have epilepsy have epileptiform activities on their EEG. Therefore, an EEG cannot be used to confirm or refute the diagnosis of epilepsy. So we will see indications. Indications of EEG are: first, unprovoked seizure, do EEG. To classify the type of epilepsy into focal or generalized epilepsy and diagnosis of various electroclinical epilepsy syndrome. Video EEG monitoring with spell capture to localize the epileptic focus in case of focal epilepsy. for epilepsy surgery. Also, EEG is used to taper anti-epileptic drugs after seizure-free interval to predict possible relapse. In some cases of meningoencephalitis, like in herpes encephalitis, EEG can show plates, that is periodic lateralizing epileptiform discharges on temporal region in herpes encephalitis. So it helps in diagnosis. To diagnose non-convulsive status epilepticus, so we can see electrical status in case of prolonged coma. So it can be useful to see electrical status in prolonged coma. Also to monitor response in epileptic encephalopathies like Best syndrome after giving ACTH, prednisolone, we can monitor the response with EEG. In children with recent onset cognitive or language regression, even without seizures, to rule out epileptic encephalopathy like continuous spike wave discharges in sleep and Landau-Kleffner syndrome, we should do EEG. So these are the few indications of EEG. Then comes neuroimaging. First is the ultrasonography. It may be helpful as an urgent investigation in NICU. Like in intrabatum hypoxia ischemia, it can show PVL. It can show intracranial hemorrhage and certain structural lesions, but because of lack of sensitivity, it is not definitive. Next investigation is CT scan. If we suspect intracranial hemorrhage or calcification, do CT scan. MRI is the most valuable imaging technique in epilepsy. So we'll see what are the indications of neuroimaging in epilepsy. This is from NICE guidelines, that is National Institute of Health and Care Excellence in UK. If we are diagnosing epilepsy before the age of 2 years, do neuroimaging. Any suggestion of a focal onset on history examination or EEG, or seizures continue in spite of first line medication, do MRI. So these are the few indications of neuroimaging in epilepsy. So last case, 7 years old male child who came with normal birth and development, came with right-sided focal tonic-clonic seizures with loss of awareness, and he has 6 episodes in last 1 year. So he has focal impaired awareness tonic-clonic seizures. So we have done EEG showing frontal spike and wave discharges, and then done MRI showing left ventricular cyst. It has border also impinging on septum pellucidum and also frontal region and adjacent structures. Similarly can be seen in these images. And this is coronal section where left ventricular cyst is impinging on septum pellucidum, foramen of Monro, then also intruding in third ventricle and also impinging on adjacent structures. So this is T1 weighted image. So where here water is black, white matter is white, and gray matter is gray. So this is T1 weighted image. And this is T2 weighted image where water is white. So we can remember like World War II. So water is white in T2 image, and white matter is black and gray matter is slightly bright. So in this section also we are saying left ventricular cyst with border. So this is left ventricular large cyst, intraventricular arachnoid cyst. And if they are large and thought to be symptomatic, it can be fenestrated endoscopically. So I started oxcarbazepine to this patient and sent for neurosurgical management. So in conclusion, epilepsy is clinical diagnosis and EEG supports the diagnosis. A normal interictal EEG does not exclude the diagnosis of epilepsy. EEG is useful to establish the diagnosis of the type of epilepsy and the diagnosis of electroclinical syndrome. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul sir. Thank you, sir, for simplifying the most commonest and important topic of epilepsy, which we all come across in day-to-day practice. So the questions are welcome if anyone has question. So now I think we are all have vivid knowledge about the when to call any convulsion as epilepsy and how to classify that epilepsy and what is the role of EEG in epilepsy, neuroimaging, when to do the neuroimaging and when to involve the neurologist in the management of epilepsy. So should we proceed to the second session? Okay. And I request Dr. Nanivdekar sir, who is our EB member of Maharashtra IIP 2021, for the next session of interesting cases. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to present this case. Quite a few of you may have seen this case at some other fora. This child came to me 1 year back. This is an 8-month-old male child, first born of non-consanguineous marriage, first child, who came with a history of fever for first 1 to 2 days. This was in the first part of the May, around 18th May or so. Treated only with paracetamol and asked to follow up. The child did not follow up for some time, returned back after 10 days with a history of fever, cough, minimal breathlessness, and progressive pallor. Actually, pallor was there in the initial stages also, because I have seen this child earlier also as a routine well baby visit, and we had prescribed him hematinics, but the follow-up was not very regular. There was a history of refusal to feed and vomiting. On examination, this was a male child weighing 6.3 kg, 63 centimeters, 41 centimeters is head circumference. He was febrile, he was having mild tachypnea, but did not require oxygen. He was conscious, vitals were stable, there was significant pallor, and the respiratory system, he showed bilateral fine crepes, right more than left. And there was some amount of abdominal distension with no hepatosplenomegaly. The rest of the systems were normal. Since he was irritable, the history of fever for last 10 days with a tachypnea was advised hospitalization. So he obeyed. This was his growth chart. He was born on 20th of August, was seen earlier also in the month of April. And this was the chart which was done in the month of May. So 26th May, this was his growth chart. So you can see that there was significant drop in the height. I mean, he has not gained too much of weight, and the height also had not grown much. So clinical diagnosis of pneumonia, the only thing is he was not a typical child with pneumonia because there was crepitations. I expected him to have the diagnosis was lower respiratory tract infection. We had subjected but the child was not very severely ill. He was not requiring oxygen despite having. So the investigations were done. He had a hemoglobin of 4.7, 28,000 counts, 70 polymorphs, 28 lymphocytes, 2 eosinophils, 00, and a platelet count of 6,95,000. The MCV was 64, MCH was 14.2, 14.8, PCV 20.8. MCHC of 22.9, urine was normal. Since this was the X-ray picture, he had shown a large patch, right upper zone, right lower zone, or lower zone. With such a pneumonia, it is usually recommended that you do the ultrasound also to see whether there is presence of fluid. So there was not much of pleural reaction. So what would be the opinion of the audience? What do you think we should be doing in such a child? What would be our clinical diagnosis and how should we proceed? Let us have discussion on this. Okay, so the initial diagnosis was that we will think in terms of bacterial pneumonia first, which is a common thing. But the things which were odd were with such a large patch of pneumonia, the child did not have any oxygen requirement. The child was not toxic. The fever was there, but the fever was coming once or twice in a day. Interfebrile period, the child was remaining normal. With this, we started off first with antibiotics, initially with coamoxiclav, and then later on, because the fever did not subside after 48 hours, 72 hours, which I shifted over to ceftriaxone and azithromycin, which I thought was okay for this child at this stage. And idea was to see what is happening. But the parents were given an idea that we are probably looking into something which is not typical. So we will see how this child improves or this child progresses in due course of time. With this, we also was the time when the COVID had just started. So we had done his RT, his Mantoux test was negative, the gastric aspirate for AFB was negative, and the stool for occult blood was negative. The reason for doing stool for occult blood is at the age of 8 months, this child's hemoglobin was 4.7. This was a child who was exclusively breastfed and was put on hematinics prior to in the prior visits. We'll come to that little later. There was no history of exposure to cow's milk. There was no history of hemoptysis. There was no reason why we should have suspected why this child's hemoglobin should have dropped so drastically. There was no splenohepatomegaly, so and his counts were not suggestive of any hemolysis per se. So, question was, how do we proceed? So, as we said, he was treated with IV antibiotics. The fever reduced, the generalized toxicity reduced, the tachypnea reduced, and there was no oxygen requirement. The appetite improved marginally, but he continued to have his symptoms, and the child was not showing signs of improvement. So when we did his counts, he was admitted with me on 26th of May 2020. Initially seen as a well baby child on 9th of December. He was born on 20th of August. So initially seen on 9th of December, 21st of December, 25 again. All this time we had advised hematinics, prescribed hematinics in proper doses, and the parents were little bit, they were not giving the hematinics properly. So I was attributing this probably to the non-compliance of the hematinics. You can see that this child had 8.7, 8.8, 7.4. But what was striking was every time this child was having counts which were definitely high. And on two accounts, this polymorphonuclear predominance. And every time the platelets were way high in his all the CBCs. The ESR also was 57, 20, 30. And when this child was admitted this time, the hemoglobin of 4.4, 28,000 WBC count with 78 polymorphs, 20 lymphocytes, with an ESR of 88 with a platelet count of 6,95,000. A follow-up count was done at a hematology lab, which also showed a count hemoglobin of 5.5, 33,000 with 57, 37 and 7 ESR of 74 and a platelet of 5,28,000. The MCVs were always 57, MCH was 15, PCV was 20. The RDWs was around 2024. So this was the child with anemia and there was pneumonia which was not responding. So of course, tuberculosis was ruled out in this child. So what further investigations one would do and what would be the treatment of choice and differential diagnosis in view of history and progress? Shall we open this for discussion? Does anyone want to comment? Anyone wants to comment?
To rule out immunodeficiency.
Yes. Immunodeficiency. Yes. How do you think of immunodeficiency?
Can it be pulmonary, pulmonary hemosiderosis?
Yeah, pulmonary hemosiderosis. The only thing is usually you don't see pulmonary hemosiderosis. This was the thing which we definitely thought of, but pulmonary hemosiderosis will not come so early in age. And basically, if we see the basic pattern of pulmonary hemosiderosis, the lungs would get affected. There will be hemoptysis, and it will be a typical generalized what we get of ARDS like picture. The X-rays would be like an ARDS rather than DPN. In view of the fever which was biphasic, the child was otherwise fine in between. I also thought in terms of a vasculitis, but the child was because there was the ESR which was also high. But immunodeficiency is one thing which I had kept in mind. Hemosiderosis also we had kept one thing in mind. Of course, in a 9-month-old child, thinking of foreign body was not something which you would have thought of, because this child would have been having a lot of cough as a predominant factor, which was not there. So this is the, you can see that on 26th of June, this was almost after a month or so, this child continued to have this patch of pneumonia which was there.
So this
They,
anemia, this child, hello?
Yes.
So the anemia, if this lesion is persistent, maybe some congenital malformation.
Yes, I thought
from the beginning.
congenital malformation. Now, in order to come to a diagnosis in such a child, just X-ray chest alone would not be sufficient. So we thought of doing the next test. The three things which came to my mind was either a congenital malformation or some atypical organism. But by atypical organism, this child should have shown response to azithromycin. Tuberculosis is one thing which we can think of, but since the child was having a negative TT and the gastric aspirate was negative, we did not subject this child for AKT. Empirical AKT was not started. Okay. So the next thing which we thought was a CT chest. So CT chest showed the patches of pneumonia which are there. This was not a congenital malformation. We can see there were extensive patches which were seen on the right zone. The previous X-ray has not shown anything on the left side, which was initially seen in the first X-ray on 26th of May. So this continued to show a patch of pneumonia. Only thing is the diagnosis, I mean, there was no significant etiology which could be ascertained just by this. Of course, a foreign body or any other malformation was also ruled out by doing a CT scan. This time I had a word with Sainath and we decided to go ahead with the bronchoscopy, because we wanted to know the etiological diagnosis. So trying to get the bronchoalveolar lavage and see what was the organism which is there. But even if it was some other organism which is severe enough to cause pneumonia, by now the child should have deteriorated and the child should have shown some other signs like say lung abscess or some empyema which would be coming up, which was not there. So we did the, okay, so these are the things which we thought of. There was one thought of cystic fibrosis also, but the only thing is because the child did not have any other features, there was no severe failure to thrive in this child. And there was no family history. This is, of course, this is a first child, non-consanguineous marriage. So although we had done his electrolytes, we all know that it's not very easy to get the sweat chloride done. The electrolytes, the chlorides were normal. The arterial blood gas did not show any sign of metabolic acidosis. So the next thing which we thought, immunodeficiency is one thing which we had thought of. So bronchoscopy was done. Bronchoscopy was done, which showed minimal signs of inflammation. There was no foreign body, obviously, no iron-laden macrophages, and the gram staining was AFB negative. There was no organism seen. There was few gram-positive cocci which were seen. Probably could be the contaminant which have come from the upper airway itself. And the culture subsequently did not show any growth. But this child showed a strongly positive galactomannan test, which suggested that probably this was aspergillosis. And in view of the aspergillosis, we thought that why this child who is otherwise okay should have an aspergillosis in a community setting. So simultaneously, we had sent his sample to Bangalore for nitroblue tetrazolam test, NBT test. We had discussed this last time when we had a previous child of similar illness, but that child's presentation was different. So this was a standard assay for phagocyte oxidase activity. Colorless compound NBT is reduced to blue formazan by the activity of enzyme system. Phagocytes adhering to the slides are activated and develop blue inclusions with NBT. The number of NBT positive cells are scored under a microscope. False negative findings occur when formazan accumulates in cells with low level of active NADPH oxidase, NADPH oxidase. Clinically have the disease, but their NBT tests are negative. An alternative technique, leukocytes are isolated from blood and incubated with NBT in a test tube. fluorescence is solubilized by addition of organic solvent. Blue color intensity is read by spectrophotometer. So this is a preferred screening and diagnostic test for chronic granulomatous disease. The most accurate diagnostic test for chronic granulomatous disease. The phagocytic cell reduced DHR to strongly fluorescent compound rhodamine. This is the DHR test. Individual fluorescent cells can be counted and amount of fluorescence per cell is quantified with flow cytometry, and combine the best feature of slide and dip tube NBT test. So the X-linked carriers of the CGD also can be diagnosed with this DHR test. So for this particular child, the neutrophil oxidative burst appeared reduced. So it was recommended that clinical features should be correlated with the diagnosis of chronic granulomatous disease. And the transport control sample showed preserved oxidative burst. So the control sample showed normal A, and the NBT dye reduction was totally absent in the test sample. So the diagnosis was chronic granulomatous disease. This was the child hospitalized, which was otherwise comfortable. This is the photograph taken before he went for further investigations. Remember, it was a lockdown time, and it was very difficult for this child to travel anywhere. But we had referred this child to Mumbai because the father was working as an ESIS employee. So this was they were having tie-ups with few different institutes. One of them was in Bangalore, one of them was SRCC Hospital Children. So I recommended him to go to SRCC, which was approachable at that time. But still, with high cases of COVID, it was a difficult task for him to reach Mumbai, but he somehow persisted and went to Mumbai. In the meantime, this child was put on the antifungal drug in view of suspected aspergillosis, and he did not respond. The child went to Mumbai and continued to remain there, and he was there in the hospital for quite some time. Subsequently was shifted to initially we had given him fluconazole, and then later on we used the drug for the aspergillosis. But it did not respond. So that put him on some antifungal. I do not remember the name offhand. So was sent for further investigations. First, parents were tested and the child was referred for the bone marrow transplant, which is the treatment for this particular condition. The first donor was ready, but unfortunately to have malignancy and he dropped out. So the blood was again matched, and father's blood was used because he was showing a 60% matching. So father had so post 5 months, it is now 5 months post transplant. The child is doing well. Now remembering Dr. Karwa sir, because whenever we talk about such things, we have to always keep in mind the social aspect. The total cost involved in this child was 12 lakh rupees. This was done at SRCC hospital. The father raised by 2.5 lakhs and was given support from local donors. The rest was done, was sanctioned by ESIS. The child underwent bone marrow transplant successfully. This is the situation now. This child has come back. He is today weighing 8 kg, 80 centimeters. So this is his growth chart. So this also, you can see that there was till the time bone marrow was not done, he was definitely having lapse. Then subsequently started picking up. The head circumference also has picked up, and so also his height. So the point is that whenever we see a child who has come with pneumonia, once the first few days have gone, once we have seen that the antibiotics have not worked, we have to think laterally and we have to see what other causes of pneumonia would be present. Either it could be immune mediated or it could be fungal. The organism could be atypical, and we should be going ahead with further investigations, which include CT scan, chest, and the bone marrow. And also in a clinical setting like this, we have to think in terms of immunodeficiency. While CT scan would, rule out the abnormal, any congenital malformations or any other situations. The bone marrow, I mean the test for the primary immunodeficiency will reveal conditions like chronic granulomatous disease. So this is the child and who is done well. If you remember last year, we had presented a case which was 8-year-old child who presented with multiple episodes of pneumonia and was having initially very high eosinophil count, and subsequently his routine counts also showed a persistent polymorphonuclear predominance with high ESR. That was the child which we had subjected to the primary immunodeficiency panel and was shown to have chronic granulomatous disease. So if we keep an approach which is there, we usually reach to a diagnosis, and whenever such a diagnosis is made, the father is coming from a not a very great socioeconomic background, but still could manage to get this child's treatment done. And crowdfunding plays a major role in managing such children. So one should not leave hope, and usually we can get to some end to such situations. Thank you. Any questions? I thank Sainath for extending his support. He was instrumental in getting the bronchoscopy done, and it was the case where a teamwork was what was important in such a scenario. Any questions?
Sir, what is the usual age of presentation of these children, sir?
Usually they present slightly late. If you see the usual pathology, chronic granulomatous disease, as they say, is the granulomas which are formed. The basic pathology is there are multiple polymorphonuclear cells, but they are not able to function. So it's like an army. It's a lot of army with no arms with them. So usually they can present early also, but majority of the time they present slightly in later childhood with multiple episodes of infection. Although by 2 to 3 years, they can have presentations of pneumonias, recurrent pneumonias. Now, if we see this child presented very early in age, and we have seen the previous child who presented little late in age. He presented at the age of 8 years. In fact, he had hypereosinophilic syndrome early in an infancy, and then later on he had a period of lull for almost 3 to 4 years, and he started developing recurrent pneumonias at the age of 8 years. But majority of the times, early childhood and maybe in slightly elder age also, the child will present with multiple pneumonias, skin infections, and maybe GI infections, because they can get even obstructions in due course of time because of the granulomas which are formed in the GI tract. This child did not get time to present his GI symptoms. So this was the situation. Now, Amit has asked, does the child have any neurocutaneous markers like caffeole? No, he did not have any caffeole spots. The skin was bang normal. The point of discussion is that whenever such a thing is seen, we have to do some lateral thinking. As primary immunodeficiency, we have to think of vasculitis syndrome also. This child, we did not do vasculitis workup simply because by that time we were coming to a diagnosis. The first thing which we sent was the immunodeficiency panel because of the previous experience, and that came on the day when we did the bronchoscopy, and so we almost had a diagnosis on our hand. Otherwise, if this child was not to respond to any of these, and suppose the galactomannan was not to come positive, you would have definitely thought in terms of even doing the PANCA. So you have to do the anti-nuclear cytoplasmic antibodies. So because the GP or the vasculitis, pulmonary angiitis, so that is something which we should be thinking of. So all these other causes which are there should be thought of. That is the purpose of presenting this case.
So did he receive steroids, sir?
So at no point of time he received steroids, because that is one thing which I did not start, because that would have altered the picture probably. And the first and foremost thing is, if you see the pre-BMT photograph, he was running fever, but he was otherwise comfortable. The toxicity was not there. So there was no reason for rushing in for steroids, because that would have been used as a sort of life-saving, because the child was otherwise comfortable. We did not start. And also the point to be thought of is, I did not start with AKT on this child because uh, there was a urge, or there could be a thought that we should be at least covering this child with AKT till the time some diagnosis is made. So with that we did not do, because even the BAL was done has shown, because okay, we get a gastric aspirate which may be negative, which could be false negative. But once you have done a bronchoalveolar lavage, and that also shows no AFB, we were sure that we are not dealing with tuberculosis.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good thing, sir.
Yeah.
Sir,
Otherwise, modified the course.
Yeah, probably, yes.
Yes.
Sir, just a doubt.
Yes.
Can any connective tissue disorder with immune hemolytic anemia present at such a young age?
I'm really not, probably Mahesh would be able to answer, but I think 8 or 9 months is a bit too early to for such a presentation. But rarely they could be. But we have to definitely think of connective tissue disorders also. And I have not yet come to conclusion why this child continued to have anemia, because further workup was done at the SRCC hospital. I'm yet to see the entire file of his, because the child has just returned back to Kolhapur few days back.
And
Mahesh,
has he
what is your experience? 9-month child coming with autoimmune hemolytic anemia with connective tissue disorder with pulmonary involvement.
Yeah, all below 1 year, if they have connective tissue disorder, it is usually genetic disorder. All like SLE also, they are saying that it is monogenic SLE. Okay, all immunodeficiency, they are genetic in origin. Okay, so anything below 2 years and such a florid presentation, we should think of genetic causes or immunodeficiency.
Yes.
These are two.
Yeah, excellent.
So can you just throw light on approach to primary immunodeficiency? What are the screening tests should be done first and then further?
See, basically, primary immunodeficiency means we'll have to see all the antibody levels. First, we have to see the differential count, and there you have to go for flow cytometry, because you have got T cell arm, you have got B cell arm, then you have got immunoglobulins. So flow cytometry, where they do all the detailed analysis of the lymphocytes. So CD4, CD8, and all the differentials are seen in details. Then they do these tests for the phagocytic activity. Then all the immunoglobulins are seen. And once this is what we call as primary immunodeficiency or PID panel, where these basic tests are done, and you come to some conclusion about the presence or absence of immunodeficiency. And if not, then further higher tests are done. Probably hematologist will be in a better position to answer this question. Because as a primary pediatrician, our aim is to think in that channel whether we are dealing with a primary immunodeficiency or not. And there your clinical features plus one of these abnormal findings where the counts are high, but still the child is getting recurrent infections. Then you do the differentials, and the differentials are normal. The lymphocytic, the CD4, CD8 counts, CD3 counts, all those, whatever the absolute counts are, because that detail, the report is very extensive. And we have to literally search each and every report. What is the CD4 and what are the normal for that particular age, whether they are normal or not. So all these need to be seen. And then of course immunoglobulin levels, those have to be seen, whether all the immunoglobulin levels are normal for that particular age, because as the age changes, the values are going to change. Mahesh, you want to throw some light?
Yeah, one clue in CBC will be total lymphocytic count. Yes. And Sagar has said that if it is below 3000, absolute lymphocyte count below 3000 will give a clue to say that we are dealing with severe combined immunodeficiency. That is one.
Yeah, that reminds me of one child where
we
had one child where, of course, this child succumbed. The prominent feature was that the child was having pneumonia, and since the child was not having severe respiratory distress, initially was managed on oral medicines, but because the distress increased, we got him hospitalized. At that time, COVID was not there. This was some 3 years back. And we investigated, we thought of the H1N1 also, nothing came positive, but the feature which was there, which Mahesh pointed out at that time, every time this child had a count of 20,000, 21,000 and a polymorphonuclear cells of 94 with a 6 lymphocytes. So definitely his lymphocytes were lacking. We were fortunate enough that we could send this sample again to Bangalore, this Anand's lab, and ultimately this child went into respiratory ARDS, and after ARDS, this child succumbed. But till the time the child was there, after the child's death, we could get the reports and which showed that this child was having a severe combined immunodeficiency. So at least the, I won't say the skin was saved, but at least we could tell the relatives that this is the diagnosis. I had told them that whenever you go for a such next child, do not rush to give a BCG before we send the primary sample once the child is born. Unfortunately, we lost this child on follow-up because they thought that probably the child was not managed well. That is the way the things happen. So, but then this was the lesson which we had learned, that if you've got such a child who dies, the next time we should not rush to even give any live vaccine. First investigate. Giving that vaccine, say 10 days, 20 days later does not make any difference. But at least you are able to diagnose the condition properly so that we can prognosticate such a child in a better way.
Absolutely.
Excellent management.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So any other case, sir?
No, I'll just take this as an opportunity. We have got one with the permission of the President and the Secretary. We have got Rational Antibiotic Practice Quiz, which is arranged by IIP Pune. We've already advertised this in our WhatsApp group. Our team is ready, so the zonal rounds will be there. There are other teams from Sangli district, Sangli city, Sangli, the Satara, which are also ready. Ratnagiri, Sindhuru teams are also ready. So we'll be having a zonal round here, and then we will be the winners would move further to compete with the Maharashtra state other branches. So our team is ready. All the best to them.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for the very interesting case and very interesting discussion also. Thanks all our KP members for the active participation. Good night. Good night.
Just before we conclude, but I will still like to meet all the people in presence in physical meeting. Maybe in the month of July, probably we get the things opened up by then. Yes. If not, at least till August, because that gives the real fun.
Yes, definitely, please.
Okay. Pulling a leg of Dr. gives us good.
Forwards.
Okay then. Thank you.
Okay. Nice case.
Nice discussion.